Spaceballs, most likely the most well-known Star Wars parody ever made, and beloved by many. Recently I watched this film, and today I'm reviewing it. Does Spaceballs live up to the hype, or is it overrated? I'll start with a quick spoiler-free rundown on my thoughts of the film, in case you haven't seen it yet. Personally, I think it's overrated. If you go in with high expectations, you'll be disappointed as I was. However, there's much to like, particularly in the second half of the film. It can be a difficult and boring watch, but if you watch with friends, that's made easier. As parodies go, I think it's not as good as it could have been, filled with a lot of jokes that personally didn't land for me, although when the jokes did land, they were great. The story could have been executed a lot better to make it more exciting, but I can see why the film has developed a cult audience. Also, I found that I had generally seen most of the best bits before anyway, but it was interesting to see them as part of the story. And that's all I've got before I get into spoilers. If you have a spare hour and a half and love parodies, give it a watch. But if you're uncertain on whether you want to dedicate yourself to the whole movie, you may want to consider watching the opening and then skip into the climax, as that's a quick way of appreciating some of the best gags of the film. Anyway, on to spoilers. For those who are bothered, I'm moving on in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so I figured it would be best to begin my spoiler review with a summary of the film, along with a rundown of what I liked about the movie, as there were quite a few things I did enjoy. The opening crawl was great, and really captured the essence of a Star Wars opening crawl, while also being quite humorous. The eye test gag was a real highlight, and in my opinion, actually one of the best of the film. This is followed up immediately by a shot of an extraordinarily long ship passing the camera, which is a good play off of the classic Star Wars opening. This also brings me on to the bumper stickers, which I think are a nice touch. They're just an added bit of humour which really reflects the character of the story world, and are perfect for having fun with the Star Wars franchise. After this, we're introduced to Dark Helmet and the Spaceballs, who are en route to kidnap Princess Vespa at her wedding, so that they can get the codes they need to successfully steal the heir from Druidia. At the wedding, Princess Vespa runs away and flies off-world, leading me to the next gag I liked. This one based around Leia's buns in A New Hope. Turning them into headphones was a great way of acknowledging the wild design from the original film, and I can't lie, those buns do look like headphones. Another joke I really enjoyed came up just after, playing on Star Trek's transporter. Here President Scroob takes the transporter, and things go very wrong, before he just walks to his destination instead. It's a scene that I'd recommend looking up and watching for yourself if you're interested. Obviously, it's not a Star Wars joke, but I think that it's a huge benefit that Spaceballs didn't limit itself to just Star Wars. After this, Princess Vespa is caught in a magnetic beam by the Spaceballs, and Lone Star comes and rescues her, his mind set on the large payment her father offered for her safe return. He whizzes her away at hyperactive, but soon finds he's out of gas, and crashes into the desert. I'm so glad that Mel Brooks managed to get this setting in, as it's just so Star Wars, and this section of the film nicely mirrors C-3PO and R2 in A New Hope, while very much not being a plain copy. Another fun gag happens while the gang wander around the desert. In attempts to locate Princess Vespa, Dark Helmet watches Spaceballs. That's right, he watches the film he is in. This is an iconic gag, and a joy to see, particularly with Rick Moranis' over-the-top performance. This is the sort of shenanigans which I think is perfectly suited for a parody movie, and I'm glad to see it. Not long after this, the gang collapse in the desert and are saved by a group of dinks. They then introduce us to none other than Yogurt. I think Yogurt was such a fun character, and from the moment he was introduced, I felt that the movie was more enjoyable, although of course that wasn't just because of Yogurt. As a British person though, I must say this joke doesn't hit quite the same, as we actually would pronounce it as yogurt. That's not a complaint though, I just thought it'd be fun to mention. With yogurt, also comes the introduction of Spaceballs merchandise. The film has so many merchandise gags, which I really enjoyed, and it actually became a bit of a game of finding the merch in the different scenes. I bet the prop makers absolutely loved working on this film. Fun fact though, George Lucas actually forbade Mel Brooks from making any actual Spaceballs merch, which I think somehow makes the joke even funnier. While the gang are with yogurt, Lone Star is given a ring and taught to use the Schwartz. No prizes for guessing what that's parodying. While everyone is sleeping, Princess Vesper is lured out and taken by Dark Helmet. This leads to a part of the film I quite enjoyed, the rescue of Princess Vesper. This was simply a fun sequence and was a nice reference to rescuing Leia in A New Hope. After this, the ship Spaceball 1 transforms into Mega Maid, a giant robot with a vacuum cleaner, ready to suck the air out of Druidia. And I just think that's such a fun and wild idea, and I'm so glad they took that swing, because yeah, they've got the opportunity to do it, so why not do it? The suction process begins, but Lone Star uses the Schwartz to flip a switch and reverse it. He then flies into the ear of Mega Maid in a way that parodies the Death Star run from Return of the Jedi. More on that in a bit. Inside, Lone Star gets out and searches for a self-destruct button, and once he gets to it, he comes face to face with Dark Helmet. The pair get into a duel in what is easily the best scene of the entire movie. If you haven't seen the film, then I'd definitely recommend searching up this scene, as it won't take long to watch and is simply fun. I won't get into details here, as I don't really want to spoil it for those who may wish to watch the battle, but not the whole movie. Anyway, I will say that the gag of Dark Helmet accidentally hitting a boom op was really funny, and maybe actually my favourite of the entire film. Of course, the self-destruct button does end up being hit, giving about 3 minutes for everyone to escape. Parts extend from the Mega Maid's head for escape pods, turning it into an imitation of the Statue of Liberty. Lone Star gets back to his ship and flies out of the Mega Maid in a way which is once again reflective of the Return of the Jedi Death Star run, with the Mega Maid exploding behind him. I loved this reference, as it's just classic Star Wars, and exactly the sort of thing I wanted out of a Star Wars parody movie like this. After this, Lone Star flies Princess Vesper to Druidia, and drops her off where she is set to have her wedding. Lone Star visits a space diner, where another fun gag is made. Across from Lone Star is sat none other than John Hurt, who soon finds himself in excruciating pain. An alien bursts out of his stomach, just as it did in the hit movie Alien. This joke is great fun, and a good way of referencing such an iconic space sci-fi movie. After this, Lone Star discovers from a fortune cookie given to him by Yogurt that he is actually a prince, and he sets course for Druidia. Meanwhile, one of my favourite gags happens as an arm and the head of Mega Maid crashes onto the beach of an alien planet, in a way that references the iconic shot of the Statue of Liberty from the end of the Planet of the Apes. A pair of apes ride over to the ship, and watch as Dark Helmet, President Scroob, and Colonel Sanders climb out. This joke was so much fun, and actually caught me by surprise, despite it being set up by the escape pods already making the Mega Maid look like the Statue of Liberty. After this, Lone Star makes it just in time to stop Princess Vesper's wedding, and marries her himself. And that's the end of the movie, but I've still got a few more compliments to give. First of all, the costumes were great. Dark Helmet was a standout, and I loved his goofy tie. Lone Star was also done well, and there's a funny story behind his outfit. You see, George Lucas forbade Mel Brooks from dressing Lone Star as Han Solo, but Mel Brooks simply dressed him as Indiana Jones instead, which I think actually worked better than if Lone Star had simply been dressed as Han Solo. Besides this, I also loved that Mel Brooks was able to get aspects of all 3 Star Wars movies into the story, with the rescue of Princess Vespa and being lost in the desert being very A New Hope inspired, the time with yogurt being very Empire Strikes Back inspired, and the destruction of Megamaid being very Return of the Jedi inspired. Also, I actually quite liked the creative decision to not have a Luke stand-in the movie, but to instead merge him with Han Solo. It worked really well for this parody movie, and allowed Lone Star to shine. Additionally, Rick Moranis did an amazing job. He was perfect casting for Dark Helmet, and was a real star in the film. Finally, I like slapstick comedy, and this movie had some good slapstick, which is fun and worked well, being used in moderation. Anyway, now that I've run down the rough story of the movie, and explored what I liked about it, let's get into the criticism. First, I'd like to look at the characters. I think there's a big problem here in that they're generally just not good parodies of the characters they represent. Take Princess Vespa for example. She acts nothing like Leia, instead being a caricature of a princess, which I don't think is fair for Leia as a character who is simply so much more than a princess, and who actually doesn't act overly princessy. However, I think the biggest example is Barth. He's a disgusting character who is simply nothing like Chewbacca, not even in design. I would have preferred something more like Wookiee Monster from the parody film Hardware Wars, although of course that film was a lot shorter and didn't really tell its own story or expand on its characters. The only characters which I think really successfully represent their characters was Lone Star and Dot Matrix. However, I found Dot Matrix to be quite forgettable. This is possibly because C-3PO is already a comedic character, so Dot Matrix didn't really stand out as much. Also, looking at Lone Star and Princess Vespa, their character arcs, moving from hating each other to loving each other, was very rushed, which is a shame. Of course the actual Star Wars movies had more time to execute this, with Han and Leia, but I do think Spaceballs could have made it a bit less of a light switch moment when they suddenly fell for each other. Anyway, I may have had some issues with the film's characters, but I think that its biggest crime was simply that it was quite boring. I understand that earlier I gave a big list of things I liked, full of enjoyable gags, but I found that for every good joke in the film, there were many that fell flat. A slightly odd example of this comes when the Spaceballs are searching the desert. President Scroob orders that they comb the desert, and this hilariously cuts to some guys quite literally combing the desert with a giant comb. This is a hilarious visual, and no more was needed. However, Dark Helmet and Colonel Sanders then discuss the order afterwards, which massively cheapens the joke. Also, I found that the humour in the scene where Scroob makes the order fell flat too. And to be honest, I think this is a generous example of the problem, as there were scenes in the first half of the movie where none of the jokes landed for me. Of course, humour is subjective, so I won't be too harsh on that. However, I think there was more to my boredom than the jokes. One part of the film that generally didn't work for me was President Scroob. I just didn't really care about his plotline, and was uninterested when the film cut to him. I'll admit, I loved the transporter joke with him, and he was ripe for jokes, but that's not enough to make me a fan of his entire screen time, which could have been refined. The movie also suffered from a very dull first half. Here I felt as though the story was just happening rather than actually engaging with it. I think the execution here was just unfortunately quite poor. Like a princess running away from her own wedding should be very exciting, but it just wasn't, and we didn't even really get a chance to hugely explore Princess Vespa's character through this, which was a real shame. Also, the film executed Pizza the Hut quite poorly, despite the pun being fun. You see, Pizza the Hut is entirely a joke, and doesn't serve as a good initial compelling reason for Lone Star to take the job. A New Hope did it far better with Jabba and Greedo, but the parody simply failed to capture the sense of danger that made that work. Instead, it's all about Jabba being made of pizza. On top of these two examples, the rescue of Princess Vespa from the magnetic beam should have also been more engaging, but it just wasn't, actually feeling quite safe and slow when it could have been made more intense. This would have established the Spaceballs as a greater threat as well. I do understand they're meant to be seen as a goofy threat, but we should at least feel some sort of intimidation there. Moving on, I found that the time Lone Star and crew spent wandering the desert was quite dull, without anything strong within it. Not even the campfire scene worked for me. The only bit that I did find funny there was the joke with the giant box and the hairdryer, but this in no way saved that part of the film. However, I've got some good news, as the movie did actually get better after Yogurt showed up, at the midpoint of the film, and the climax was genuinely engaging. Unfortunately, the journey to the second half of the film was lacking. I watched this film with a group of friends, and afterwards the general consensus was that many of us wouldn't have finished the film in one sitting if we had watched by ourselves. I personally think that a strong first half would have been the hook we needed to commit to sticking with it, even if we were alone. Overall, just because the film is a parody, it doesn't mean that it can't fully commit to the excitement of its circumstances, or the depth of its characters, while also being funny. Finally, another problem that I had was that the film didn't really scratch the Star Wars itch. Of course, this is not a Star Wars movie, so there were always going to be differences, but as a parody of Star Wars, it just didn't feel Star Warsy enough, which is a real shame. To me, the parodying felt quite shallow and didn't embody Star Wars enough. This is shown in my previous point on the characters being unlike their Star Wars counterparts. I guess I just didn't really feel the sense of appreciation for the source material, which hurt my perception of the film. To me, it seems that the movie didn't really take what we love about Star Wars and make humour from it, but instead picked out different notable aspects and latched onto them in a way that didn't really capture that Star Wars magic. It had the structure of a Star Wars movie, but not the heart. And what's annoying is that I think small details could have gone a long way to fixing this issue. Like we could have had a Spaceball hit their head in the corridor like the Stormtrooper did in A New Hope, or included a play on the "I have a bad feeling about this" line. I also think that some goofy transitions could have gone a long way and really added to that Star Wars charm. It would also have been very funny. Another thing that felt absent was the aliens. A huge majority of the characters just looked human, which is quite an uninspired choice for a movie based on Star Wars. And before you say that the budget meant that they couldn't, I'd like to mention that this film had a significantly bigger budget than A New Hope, and it didn't even need to make the costumes look as good as those ones. In recent years, the Star Wars fans have also shown how ripe the aliens of Star Wars are for parody, with the content of J. Coat on YouTube, Instagram and TikTok being notable. He created a series of made-up Star Wars characters for his skits, and they're proven quite popular. Some examples include Gaper Bingzoid, Jinky Miners, and Peter Igloo. So yeah, there's plenty of untapped potential there. So, Spaceballs. I think it's deeply flawed and definitely overrated. The story and its characters could have been written better to make the film a lot more engaging, and the quality of the parody is unfortunately lacking. However, when it works, and I'm very happy that the film was made. Yeah, it's imperfect, but movies don't need to be perfect to be enjoyed, and from what I've seen, this is very much an enjoyed movie. I feel like parody movies are often overlooked or viewed as less than other types of films. But this isn't fair, as there's a great deal of creativity that goes into an effective parody. Therefore, when a parody movie becomes as known and as loved as this one, I can't help but be pleased, as the parody is not a type of film that I think we should be avoiding or ignoring. Although of course, it's very hard to make a stunningly good parody, and I'm in no way suggesting that cinemas be absolutely flooded with parodies. I just want them to be recognised for being more than just basic copies filled with cheap jokes. Of course, there's many bad parodies out there, but there's bad movies everywhere. That doesn't mean that the potential isn't there. Anyway, before I go, I would like to briefly look ahead to Spaceballs 2. Although I was underwhelmed by the first film, I think there's great potential with the sequel. It can learn from the mistakes of the previous film, and play off of decades more Star Wars content. I see no reason why it can't be a phenomenal movie. Star Wars as a franchise is massive, and so ripe for parody. Why not continue the fun of Spaceballs 40 years later? Star Wars most certainly hasn't stopped. And hey, if it's bad, they can say they're referencing Star Wars' second entry, the holiday special.